my vision for outsourcing, as I think that first of all, outsourcing is only one particular procurement strategy, and it should be used with consideration, of course, because it's not always the answer to do an outsourcing project as such. So secondly, I think that leaders should be very clear on what the objectives with the outsourcing is, and how the outsourcing actually relates to the business's core competence, which is a very important aspect. Thirdly, I believe, from my perspective, I think that we might see some shift towards more partnership-oriented models, where actually the client and the vendor might share more incentives and risks than what we have seen before, where the contracts have been more based on strict division of responsibility with SLAs and penalties and stuff like that. And this might actually go, especially for services where it's limited knowledge on what you're supposed to buy. With relation to DASA, which I think is extremely interesting, I think that any client vendor relation, or relation in particular, needs some sort of shared terminology, and that this shared terminology would act as sort of a prerequisite for success. So with DASA, which in my opinion is a very communicable framework, especially for DevOps and agile related competence, I think that this would actually help clients and vendors communicate better in their relations in the future. I can take what I've seen companies do well first. I think that one of the main things that I've seen companies do very well is that the leaders or the executive managements have transparent objectives, and the prioritization of initiatives and stuff they are going to do are very predictable. So it's basic that everyone in the organization knows what is the most important. And for me, this is sort of a factor. I think it's called trusted leadership as such. So there's basically no micromanagement of employees. I've also seen that companies are actually having success with a fail fast approach, where they actually celebrate failure almost like a success, because failure is a prerequisite for actually learning and going forward. And all in all, it has a lot to do with how the leaders, I think, are actually setting up the organization for success by going forward with a good example, and not using sort of blame games when thing fails and stuff like that. So for the things that can go wrong, I think it's more or less the opposite of everything I said with what companies do well, basically. Unpredictable and ever-changing priorities. Leaders are not visible to the ones actually doing the work. Micromanagement through mid-tier managers and project managers and stuff like that. Blame game when things fail, and also that the managers actually choose the workers to their workers' tools. It's more like telling a carpenter that he can't choose his own hammer, in my opinion. So it's kind of strange that it is like this within IT. So I think that's mainly what I've seen companies do right and do wrong. But for me, it's a lot about leadership. I think that's quite a difficult question because it's like many things, it's dependent on several things. So, but I think first of all, you need to have a buy strategy. So, what are you actually trying to accomplish need to be known. And the contract and the procurement process should reflect this buy strategy. Secondly, I think it's very important to have knowledge about what you are actually buying. That usually is easier for commodity services, but can be harder for newer services like DevOps competence and DevOps skills and stuff like that. So I think a good example here is if you want the DevOps team to actually decrease time to market, it might not be the best idea to penalize the vendor when the deployments go wrong and stuff like that. So it's actually very contradictory. So, and what I mean with that is that the contract actually needs to be representative for what you are buying. So yeah, you might actually, if you have limited competence about what you are buying, you could actually use the procurement process to learn from the market, testing vendors with hackathons and stuff like that. But I think it would be a very good idea to have knowledge about what you are buying before you're entering the market. I think that it's probably not that different if you look at it sort of. There's not very many differences. I think probably the main differences is about how you run the procurement process, maybe. So I think that we still, when we have sort of standardized services, predictable services and stuff like that, where you know a lot about what you intend to buy, it will still be viable to actually run a traditional procurement process with a request for information, request for proposal, regular negotiations and stuff like that. But when you do not know a lot about what you're buying and it's more uncertainty, then you should actually use the procurement process to learn from the market, from the vendors, and stuff like that, because it wouldn't be very good, I think, you can't always specify the end result up front. And in the cases where you cannot specify the end result, you actually need to facilitate for some learning in the process. I think that's extremely important and something that could actually help a lot of IT and transformational projects to actually go better. And in addition, it actually makes you create a relation between the customer and the vendor at an earlier stage in time, and they will actually learn to collaborate better, I think. First of all, I'm not very fond of tracking of individuals as such. I think it might work in some environments where you have a lot of repetitive work and it's not that much about creativity, but in a sort of environment where a lot of the productivity is coming as a result of creativity, and tracking on an individual level is something I'm not very fond of. On a team level is a different story. So I think what's important there would be actually that you limit the amount of measures you have to track performance. And you also need to consider and facilitate for the fact that you are working in a highly dynamic environment or context. So I would limit the performance measures that you have on the team. I would make sure the team actually can take ownership for the measures. It should not be something that only management or executives understand and take ownership over. You should use the performance tracking mechanisms to actually learn and be better, and not to punish by actually penalizing the vendor or individuals as such. And I think in some cases it could also be a good idea to let teams assess their own performance within the team. Might not even be visible for the outside world. So I think that's my main ideas about tracking and monitoring.